Welcome to the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. If your job involves working with or influencing people's behavior, this podcast offers invaluable insights into what makes people tick. Through personal interviews that are thoughtful and surprising, we explore the full range of the roots to people smarts that can help you make or break your own career. My name is Marie Gervais, and with a Ph.D. in culture and learning in the workplace and my own cultural journey, I bring the mysteries of human beings at work around the world to you. Through conversations with very diverse people, examining the groups they were born into and the ones they chose to belong to, my podcast takes a deep dive into why people do what they do and how they belong. Hone your skills to manage others and to be a better human being at work with the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. And now for today's episode. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections listeners. Today, I'm excited to present to you Pavini Moray, who has started, failed, and succeeded at many businesses. A serial entrepreneur, they have built private practices, a worker collective, and a for-profit company. Pavini is a somatic leadership coach, specializing in helping relationships to be easy. They hold an M.Ed in Montessori curriculum design, as well as a Ph.D. in Somatic Psychology. Their new book, How to Hold Power, a somatic approach to becoming a leader people love and respect, helps leaders in all areas of business inhabit their power and lead with skill and grace. Sounds very exciting to delve into. Welcome, Pavini.
Thanks, Marie. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm happy you're here too. Please tell the audience a little bit about you and your background. Where were you born, your family, a little bit about your roots.
Sure. I am originally from the Midwestern part of the United States, and I am a parent. I have two children. I currently live in the mountains of Asheville, North Carolina, and my work is as a somatic coach who supports leaders and people who work with them to live in their bodies, to inhabit their skin, to feel their power with clarity and kindness, and to really build work relationships that are respectful, thriving, and caring. And I think it's important to say that I'm a gender nonconforming person. I identify as non-binary. I'm a queer person. And I'm also an anti-racist and an anti-capitalist. So even as I'm working to thrive in capitalism, I'm also really concerned with how do we make sure that everybody has their needs met? And how do we distribute our resources so that everyone has access to the abundance that is? So as you said, I have this new book out called How to Hold Power, which is really about helping leaders do what I said, inhabiting their power, living with ethics and integrity, and building solid work relationships.
That sounds great. Did you have siblings and parents and anything about the geography of where you first came from that is
I don't have any siblings. Obviously, I do have parents. I think the geography of the Midwest, both culturally and the landscape, is a little flat. And the people who I grew up with are pretty buttoned up. And so there wasn't a big focus on feelings, definitely not on having needs. Like the work ethic of work hard, contain, manage, those things were really prevalent in my upbringing.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a couple of incidents from your childhood that were formative for you? And formative can be something that you were interested in. It can be something that was difficult, or it can be something that was joyful. It's entirely up to you.
Sure. The first thing I'm going to tell you is about something that was all of those things. So I grew up in the 1970s. My parents were divorced, and my dad, although he was closeted, is gay. And that wasn't talked about in my family. And so while I mostly lived with my mom, I did, in fact, know, I figured it out at a young age that my dad was gay and had a gay partner. And with my mom, he was wealthy. He was a plastic surgeon, and she was really different in terms of class and access to resources. So there was this wide wealth disparity between my two households that was complicated and confusing and also interesting to me as a child. And the part about my dad being gay, I think that as a kid, it was really embarrassing. I was really ashamed of it. It was very secret about it. But as an adult, it's something I'm really proud of. Oh, this is a gift, this is a blessing. And it's really definitely helped me see the world through a very different lens than my own queerness and his queerness. And there's something about being second generation queer that feels really great to me. And so it's been interesting how that has changed and shaped me throughout my life.
Can you think of a specific incident that is in your memory?
Oh, yeah. This one time, my mom decided that she really felt like I should have a cultural education of the arts. So the symphony, the ballet, the opera. And for her, it was definitely an extravagance, a luxury. Like she would save and she prioritized those things. And my dad had season tickets. He had a box at the opera. And one night, my mom took me to the opera, and I remember sitting down on the ground floor of the theater. It's a very elaborate theater. And like looking up, and my dad didn't know I was there, and like seeing my dad in his box, and just kind of the really feeling difference in my body of like,
what a strange, disconnecting feeling.
It was really strange.
Wow. To have that kind of wealth disparity experience between the two parents like that, it must have been very unsettling.
It was weird.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great incident to explain that. What about in your adolescence or young adulthood? Is there an incident that comes to mind that you feel was formative?
The first punk show I ever went to.
Tell me about that.
So it's 1986 and it's January and it's freezing cold outside. And you're from Canada, so you understand, right? When I say freezing, I mean it's snowing and blustering and it's hard to drive. And I'm 15 and I'm wearing an outfit that my legs are bare. And I think I have like a denim jacket. I'm not completely inappropriately dressed, but my friends have told me that we're going to this concert. And so we go to this condemned theater. And I just really had no idea what punk was or what the music was or what the culture was. And we enter into this environment where the walls are literally crumbling. It's condemned. And yet it's steamy hot in there from all of the bodies and the people who are frantically and furiously dancing to this music that was unlike anything that I'd ever heard at the opera for sure. And I felt like I had come home in a certain way. And that was really my introduction to the counterculture of these underground spaces that really held a different set of values than my parents' values. And it felt like a place that there was a lot of freedom for me as a queer person who wasn't really in that identity yet, but just like could really feel what it was to be in a different space with a different set of values.
So I think what you're describing is this feeling of different worlds and in not knowing where you belong, but trying to feel your way through.
100%.
And then that brought you to a sense of how can I be in the world? And that probably led to your PhD in somatic psychology, among other things.
I think so. I mean, I think that that's probably a really accurate assessment of this lifelong question about belonging and how do I belong to myself? How do I belong with others? How do I belong in groups? And I think that so many people really struggle with this. At least for folks with any degree of difference from the norm, which I think is most of us with the perceived norm of society, it's really difficult for us to figure out our way into feeling our belonging. And so it's definitely been a lifelong inquiry and curiosity about how do I practice that? How do I actually feel that I am a part of? How do I feel this connection when, my upbringing had a lot of disconnect, as you aptly named. And how do we create that together? How do we co-create communities where we get that need met for connection and intimate knowing of one another?
Yeah, there is this piece about belonging that if you can't be yourself, you never feel like you belong. And also that people who feel they can't be themselves are striving to fit into some sort of a box that never suits them. And so really, it's weird that you would think that you need to be unique to feel like you belong. But yet, when you belong, you're likely to want to learn about at least and find some way to work with whatever the group norms are, just because you know you're accepted as your unique self. And you don't feel like you belong if you can't contribute any of that.
The word I think I would use is authentic, which is what you're speaking to, right? Is how do we express our true selves, our longings, our desires, our fears, our needs in a way that is coming from our deep, right? And bringing that out and letting ourselves be seen, letting ourselves be known, and also welcoming that in of others, right? That if I feel like that's kind of the answer that I've come to through these explorations is that if we can really embrace all who we are, all the parts especially that we have shame about and that we wish other people wouldn't see, if we can embrace all of that, then we can cultivate this inner sense of belonging to ourselves. And then it becomes easier in groups.
True. I'm thinking this piece about authenticity that you just brought up and what you said about you have to feel it within yourself is really the basis of everything. You have to feel that you yourself matter, that you love yourself, even if you don't know who you really are, and be able to move forward from that. And the belonging piece starts to fall into place when you don't feel like you don't love yourself. I think that self-love thing is really a problem for so many people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's this cultural belief that you have to love yourself before you can love others, right? But I actually don't believe that. And I think it's actually pretty problematic because it's very difficult to give to yourself something that you haven't been given. So how I reframe that is that we have to know love, we have to be loved, we have to be accepted in order to be able to give those things to ourselves. And that once we finally find like the right people, the right person, the right groups, the right witness, and they give us that love and consistency over time of just being like, yeah, and it could be a boss, it can be a leader, it can be anybody really, but somebody who sees you and says, I see you, I get you, I accept you just as you are, I accept you in all of your complexity. Once we have that, then we can bring that self-acceptance more fully to ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah, because love of others, love of self, love of the divine, love of the place, love of what you do, all of those things are interwoven with each other.
Yeah.
And we need to see ourselves in the mirror of other people's love. And we need to do that for other people too. People can go for, days, weeks, even months with nobody at work giving them a compliment or saying that they appreciate something about them. And how can you move forward if you don't know what people appreciate about you? It's helpful to get that mirror.
Mm-hmm.
So the groups that you were born into and the place that you were born into, what would you say has stayed with you and influenced your sense of culture and self now? I'm suspecting some of that might have something to do with the arts or the disconnect between pop culture and the arts or something like that. I don't know. You go ahead. What would you like to say?
Well, I think how I hold it is that all of my upbringing was informing and it didn't define who I am. Like some of it did, and some of it was in alignment with, and some of it was in opposition to, right? So, for example, the people who I grew up with did not place strong value on pleasure. They didn't value embodiment. Transparent communication is just not even a thing, right? If we have a feeling about someone or we feel grabbed by something someone said, we don't tell them that, right? We tell someone else, we triangulate, but we don't tell them. And so part of how I have determined to live my life is with these values of pleasure, embodiment, and communication, and those being really deep practices, not just things that I value, but things that I actually practice. That it matters to me to feel good in my body. It matters to me to be able to feel my body and to be able to experience all of the complex range of sensations and emotions that I have access to as a human, that we all have access to. And how I communicate with others, it's really important to me, that transparency and also kindness. But where I grew up, kindness meant like put a fake smile on, and play nice. And that's not what I mean. I mean, a kindness where sometimes you say the hard thing. You say it as lovingly as you can, but sometimes you just have to speak plainly and truly. And so I would say that those are kind of the points in opposition to my upbringing. I lived in California for a long time. And in California, when people have potlucks, if anybody who's listening has ever lived in California, that the things that get brought to potlucks are things like hummus and chips. Like you just stop at Whole Foods and you pick up something. You don't make a thing, right? And the whole time I lived in California, I was just like, this is not a potluck.
No,
right?
You have to make something.
I could hear the horror, right? And so this value of food as community, as love, of taking pride in contributing in that way is definitely something. You make a hot dish, you take a casserole, you take your tomatoes from your garden, you contribute in a way that's beautiful.
And you make your own salad dressing.
Yeah. Oh,
that's
100%.
your specialty.
Yes. I have a secret recipe.
So do I. I have 3. Yeah. And when people don't know each other that well, then they will, pick up cinnamon buns or hummus and chips, like you're saying, and bring it there. But once they know each other, they should be cooking.
Right.
All right. Yeah. So I think authenticity and a somatic experience has a lot to do with the experience of enjoying food.
Yeah. And community.
Enjoying food with other people in the pleasure of their company.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So now you also then joined groups as you got older.
Sure.
Made changes in your life. So what's happened with the changes and how has that affected the way you see yourself, your culture, your sense of belonging, your leadership?
In 2008, I was very blessed in that I went to a camp for activist organizers. And at the time, I didn't think of myself as an activist. I was teaching in a classroom and living in a suburban town, raising my kids and didn't think of myself as an activist, but I was invited to go to this camp that was for a week long. It was a spiritual retreat in the woods, and it was called Free Activist Witch Camp. And didn't think of myself as a witch, didn't think of myself as an activist. The free I could get behind because I was a single parent. And that was really my first foray into consensus process. The organizers of this camp organized by true consensus process. And there was a lot of transparency around power. There was a lot of sharing of power. There was a lot of good-hearted, good faith efforts to build an inclusive community, to really welcome, to listen, to work through hard conflict with communication and transparency and care. And it was really this experiment in how could we create a new kind of culture where power is shared and that modeling of shared power happens. So that was really cool. And I was part of that project for about 10 years, and it dissolved, I think, in 2017. And from that, I would say my leadership was really modeled after the leaders that I saw in that community, because they weren't people who were modeling power over, they were modeling power with. And if anybody got a little too grabby with the power, they were reminded to share power. There was a lot of tending of relationships. There was a lot of repair that happened after conflict. And it was messy too. Like consent. I don't know if you've ever been to a consensus process meeting. They're endless. They go on for hours. It's not a very effective way of organizing or leading or getting through a project, but it is one that has a high degree of satisfaction when things happen because everybody has bought into the process. An important tenet of consensus organizing is that you draw out dissent. You want to hear where people are feeling hesitant or reticent to agree to a decision so that it can be addressed. So there's not this culture of like yes-menning or just going along with. It's actively encouraged for people to say, okay, who doesn't agree with this? Who doesn't like this? What are your feelings about this? What do you think? What do you see? And so the facilitator of the meeting will really do that, and a good facilitator. And I think that was the other thing, is that like the facilitation skills that I learned in that community really taught me that good facilitation is essential for my leadership, that actually I cannot bear to be in meetings that are poorly facilitated anymore, because it really matters that we have a lot of integrity with how we are responding and how we are planning and how we are organizing our meetings.
Well, good facilitation requires self and other awareness and intent, like you said, to be kind and to be honest, to draw out what needs to be drawn out, and to do it in a way that people will be safe and not damaged from it, but they're going to move forward and grow capacity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
So where it falls apart in my experience is if people don't have anything to guide them, in the sense that they don't have a spiritual principle or a value compass that they can't put in place. And that isn't rigid, but I'm saying, for example, kindness is a spiritual principle, honesty is a spiritual principle, putting them together is an even more important spiritual principle. And then to value that people be in a situation where they can speak their truth and it'll be safe for them to say it, and they're thinking about how what they're saying is affecting people. That is what I mean by, if you don't have something like that to guide you, then the facilitation, even well-intentioned and skillful facilitation, can kind of fall apart with people who can pull at the edges.
Yes.
So you probably learned all of that from 10 years of that experience, didn't you?
Yeah. I also learned the value of eldership.
Yes.
How elders really increase the capacity of an entire community. The people who I was organizing with, we were all young. And I remember when I started organizing and people would say things about like, we need more elders to help guide this process. And I'd be like, no, we don't. We're fine. And then by the end of my tenure, I was like, oh my God, elders. Yes.
Yes.
Really recognizing the value that wisdom with experience can bring to a group.
Mm-hmm.
That leadership that is derived from lived experience and from going through all the things, the hard things, the good things. It just makes it easier, right? I came out of that experience not highly valuing leadership, although this was more of an anarchist organizing group. I came out with a strong value around skillful leadership.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about what you said about elders, and the beauty of being in the presence of somebody who is an elder, whether they have that as a title or not, is that they're humble about their experience and they listen and pay attention to the context. So you really feel like you have the benefit of wisdom when that happens.
Yes.
So let me ask you, people are born with a temperament, and of course there's the nature-nurture argument, but you have some traits and some things that you tend to be attracted to easily. And then your personality grows and evolves as you experience life, and you either meet and overcome or don't overcome obstacles in your path. So all of that is part of the development of your personality. So what would you say is your temperament? What would you say you just came into the world really to give? And what have you developed as a result of your life experience?
I came into the world as a dancer with a sense of awe and magic and connection to nature and spirit. I also came in with a lot of curiosity and a lot of, I would say, connection to myself, of what was important to me, what I enjoyed, what I liked. I think I was probably a pretty difficult kid to raise because I was very stubborn and knew what I wanted and didn't want to listen to what the adults wanted me to do. And as an adult, that part of my temperament is that it really translates into being very pragmatic, being very getter done without, at this point in my life, a lot of hustle culture, but like really clear on what I want to do and how I'm going to do it and when I'm going to do it. And also as an animist and really remaining committed to the principles of seeing the world as alive and seeing the magic in the world. That's temperament. And I think personality is, I've really practiced becoming a lot more playful as I have aged. I like to say that I'm reverently irreverent and irreverently reverent, that those things go together for me, that's often a way into connection with spirits. The part of my personality is that I don't ask, can I ask, how can I? Because I have that clarity of what I want to accomplish. And yeah, so I think that is how those things wind together. I don't know, it's still a work in progress. I'll tell you in 30 years how those things wind together, but that's what I got for right now.
Well, we should be a work in progress till we die, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm fine. It's a great answer. Let me ask you about a time when you experienced a sense of cultural disconnect, which you already talked about actually, right, from the time when you were a young child. But when you just felt like, wait a minute, the way I do things, which feels normal to me, is not the way other people do things. And the feeling that cultural disconnect. And that can also happen when you travel, when you go to different places, when you meet people who do things just that would be everyday, do things differently. Like when I was in India, I was not prepared for how many people were assigned to do what for me would be what one person does. And because you want to give employment to so many people, one person carries one type of suitcase and the other person carries another one. And I was like, I'll carry my own suitcases. And it was a big shock to me. And they were very insulted because they didn't get to do their job. One person would sweep one door entrance and the other person would sweep the other one. No, one person swept the whole courtyard and all the entrances, all that. That was such a shock to me. So I don't know if that's giving you an idea, but something more tangible about when you felt a moment of culture shock.
I can name a bunch of them. I lived in Bulgaria for a couple of years in the early 90s, right after the fall of communism. And Bulgaria is I think a lot of people suffer with depression there, at least in the 90s they did. And they were really impacted by the change and the downfall of the communist regime. And they had this phrase, nevozможно, which means it's not possible. And I was young, fresh out of university, coming with all these ideals. And they would say, it's not possible. And I would say, what are you talking about? It's totally possible. And I could really see the ways that it was possible and that we could do a thing. You know, for example, I got a shipment of books donated from the States to my school that I was teaching in, and it had gotten all the way to the capital of Bulgaria. And then I lived like an hour and a half away. And so I needed for the books to get driven from Sofia to Wrocław, where I was living. And I went to see the mayor of the town and I said, hey, I need to get these books, from Sofia to here. And he said, oh, it's not possible. And I was like, what are you talking about? The books have gotten literally 10,000 miles around the world. It's absolutely possible to get them another 200 miles or, here. And so that's one example of like where, and I think that's a mindset difference, that's a real place where my mindset and their mindset just were different and from our experiences.
Yeah, you didn't grow up in communism.
Right. I didn't grow up and I didn't have that sense of powerlessness and hopelessness that those folks dwelled in. I think another part of unwinding white supremacy as it lives in me there have been a lot of those moments where the way I do something and it's just like normal and natural to me isn't actually in alignment with holding a perspective that allows for multiple experiences and realities to be valid. So the worker collective that I was a part of in San Francisco, we did some anti-racism work together. And within the collective, we were a multiracial group of people. And one of the issues that I had was that our meetings always started late. And I was just in a different mindset at that time and how I was doing my work. And I just felt really intolerant about the lateness. And it never occurred to me until one of the facilitators that we were working with on the anti-racism stuff said, hey, you know what? This is a value from supremacy culture. This is this is a whiteness value that you are embodying and bringing here. And we can talk about what the agreements are around time, but like to just have this intolerance and anger about lateness, like, do you realize what you're practicing? And that was another real wake up moment for me, where I realized that just because like I had internalized this belief or value around, we must start on time, we must end on time, that it wasn't the way that everybody in the world experienced it.
Mm-hmm. Time is very culturally bound.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you may in your mind be thinking, I can be understanding with this and tolerant of this, but then it starts to take root in your mind as being anger and irritation and stuff. And you go, wait a minute, maybe I'm more attached to this idea than I thought.
That's right.
Yeah. It is a long, continuous process. And just when you get through one layer, then there's another one waiting for you. Isn't there? Yeah. Well, I don't think we're ever undone totally from colonialism and white supremacy and misogyny and all of the isms and problems that have emerged in the world as people try to control others. I think your experience of how can we do this together and how can we create something that we all agree to is really where we're going in the world. And what we're seeing now in these throes of violent power asserting themselves is the end of that era.
May it be so.
It's like before you give birth, there's so much pain. And you just think you can't see anything, and then you've got a baby.
That's a good analogy. Yeah.
So if we're going to promote you, what would you like to promote? Here's your soapbox moment. What would you love people to pay attention to or get engaged with that has to do with you in your life?
I think one of the most important emergent needs that I'm noticing, both personally and collectively, is the need for attunement. And it's vulnerable, right? It's vulnerable to open yourself to attune with someone else's needs, feelings, desires, fears, grieves, right? It's, we're not accustomed to it. It scares us. It puts us into a competition for emotional resource. But yet I spent some time this summer swimming with dolphins.
Cool.
And what I noticed in their culture was this incredible attunement of how they moved together. There was this one moment where I was on this boat and the dolphins were swimming. There were three right in a row swimming right in front of the boat. And at the this is going to sound a little gross, but at the exact same moment, the ones on either side of the one in the middle pooped, right? And I was like, how did they do that? How did they attune like that? Like there was something that happens between them in their communication that was really, it was just, they were really tracking. They were really noticing where the embodiment of each of the other dolphins was. And so I feel like
we could learn a lot from that.
Oh my gosh. Right.
Oh,
and there were all these other moments like that too, where they would like jump at the same time, or, that there was just like a lot of coordination.
Collectivist attunement.
Right. Entrainments, attunements. And I started to notice this deep longing that I have to attune with others and to be attuned with. That means to be felt with and to feel with, right?
Don't you think we all have that longing?
I think so. I think we really do. And to somehow develop more capacity to be willing to do that. I have a little bit of a TikTok problem. And one of the channels that I follow is called Karens in the Wild or something. And all of these people who are denoted as Karens, like screaming at others, right? And then being filmed. And it's really dysregulating when I watch it. But that's the opposite of it, right?
Why would you subject yourself to that kind of torture?
I don't know. It's trauma porn. I don't know. Kind of funny sometimes. Usually I don't watch them, but like I think the attunement is also the deep listening, right? It's the listening for the needs under the underbelly of whatever someone is expressing to what are they really getting at. And I think this is a skill that therapists develop, right? Because like you take a statement that on the surface is offensive or critical or mean-spirited, and then can you get underneath it? Can you get through your own layers of judgment or resistance? Can you get down to what is this person longing for? What are they crying out for? What are they needing?
Yeah. Like what's important to you about that? Where do you feel that in your body?
Exactly. Exactly. That's another important piece of attunement, is just this skill of deep listening.
Can you also tell our listeners a little bit more about what somatic means? Because if you're looking at psychological DSM manual term of somatic, it's often pejorative, but yet I use, and I know you do too, somatic approaches to work with people that allow them to experience themselves more wholly, within themselves. But how do you understand somatic, and how do you use that with your clients?
Yeah, that there is a tremendous amount of wisdom that is alive in our bodies, and we can learn to tune into that. That's how I use it, of that there is this incredible resource that's always with you that you have access to for free every moment of every day. And that's your body. And again, as a person who grew up in a culture where embodiment was not a value, right? We're supposed to disembody. We're supposed to not feel our feelings. We're supposed to, you don't get sick, you don't get injured, you work. And so for me, somatics is about this practice of coming home to ourselves, coming home to our deeper knowing and experiencing of how we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What do you need to be at your best? If somebody hires you as a coach or a therapist or anything else that you're doing professionally, what makes you feel that you can be at your best?
Being able to laugh with people, being able to be playful. The clients that I do my best work with are ones who have the ability to both, for example, be in a moment of deep grief and then a moment later be having a gentle chuckle about that. I think humor gives us a witness. It gives us a little bit of perspective where we're not so caught up in our stuff. We're not taking ourselves so seriously. And so for me, environments where play and humor are maybe welcomed is a strong word, but tolerated enables me to do my best work.
Or enjoyed when they happen?
Sure. Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to say?
I wish we could talk about power dynamics at work more. If you have ever worked for a boss, which most of us have, it's incredibly easy to feel their power, how it impacts you on your body, on your life, on your work, right? You can feel that. But my experience of becoming a boss was that it was very, very difficult for me to feel how my power, the power I was holding, impacted those who were beneath me, who I was managing.
That's a thing in the research,
Yeah.
As soon as you move up in the hierarchy in any way, shape, or form, you become insulated against feeling other people. It takes a lot of active work to be able to get into, like you were saying, attuning.
Right.
What did you do? How did you get that? How did you develop that?
Yeah, well, eventually my body led me back to it, to really putting myself into trying really hard to understand how someone might feel. And so, for example, my daughter is in college right now, and she recently had a conversation with me. She's going to come home for the holidays. She had this conversation. She's like, okay, I just want to talk with you about your expectations of me while I'm home for the holidays. And went on to say that it had been hard for her to come home for a different holiday. And she needed to be able to just do her own thing and have time by herself and didn't want me to have expectations. And my initial response was resistance. I was like, what are you talking about? I didn't even see you when you were home for the holidays very much, And then I just remembered my own experience with my parents of what does it feel like when you think your parents have expectations of you? How does that feel? Oh, you feel kind of oppressed. You feel tight. I feel like I can't be my full self. I can't express my whole self. I can't just do whatever I want. There's a physical sense of tightness and pressure and constriction, right? And so I realized that that's what she was talking about. It wasn't about me or my parenting or anything like that, but she was expressing her own experience of our power dynamic, really, of how it is for her in her body to experience the power differential that is just inherent between a parent and a child, right? And so through that lens of trying to empathize, really trying to feel what she might be experiencing. And I went in through the lens of my past, right? I was able to be okay, she is naming an experience that she's having. I can have empathy for that because I've also had that experience. And so I think as leaders and as bosses, we can actively cultivate and call to mind those experiences that we've had as being on the receiving end of someone's power and how that impacts us to try and put ourselves in their shoes.
That is a lovely sentiment for us to end the interview with.
Great.
Yeah, it's great. It kind of brings us full circle. Thank you so much, Pavini. It's really so nice to have had this conversation with you. I enjoyed it very much. I think we could continue for hours.
I agree, Marie.
But we won't.
But we're not.
But thank you very much. It was just such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Pavini Moray has experienced many disconnects in life, yet stayed grounded to the experience of nature, playfulness, and increasingly transparent authenticity. Defining culture first in terms of what they did not identify with, Pavini came to a sense of belonging when others saw them in complexity and could be sincerely welcoming. They grew into a more personalized leadership approach through their varied experiences of teaching, activism, worker collectives, and eventually achieving a Ph.D. in Somatic Psychology. I really enjoyed Pavini's reflective gentleness, the childhood descriptions of being in the budget section of the opera house with their mother while looking up at the wealth of their father's personal opera box, sharply contrasted with the out-of-body experience of a punk concert in a condemned building, and were deeply evocative for me. Here are a few of my takeaways from this conversation with Pavini. 1. Belonging is complex and requires that we mirror love and acceptance to each other. 2. Having an embodied experience brings us to our more authentic sense of who we are and could become. 3. Power dynamics are always at play, and unless we can consciously attune to the other person's experience and validate them through our acknowledgement, we may never see the true picture. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast, and that you liked it so much that you will share it with a friend and help us grow our audience. Thank you so much for listening, and may Culture and Leadership Connections continue to guide and inspire your day. Newsflash! Listeners can now interact with Culture and Leadership Connections podcast by leaving a voice or text message on Fan List. It is a fun and quick way to let me know what you liked, ask a question, or leave a suggestion. I will feature some of the voice messages on upcoming episodes. You might be surprised to hear your own voice, but only if you leave a message, of course. So to leave your personal message or your question, go to shiftworkplace.com/podcast and click on the Fan List link to leave it. I can hardly wait to hear what you have to say.